This week we're going to look at the history of Passover and kind of how it's changed and evolved through time, how historical events and situations have shaped how the Jews have celebrated Passover, as well as somewhat how Christians have celebrated Passover and how those two sects have interacted. As we go through this, we're going to learn a lot about Jewish history, and we want to be clear that we don't want to idealize or idolize the Jews. They're a people that need God just like everybody else. We also don't want to act as though we would have done better. There's a lot of mistakes that they made, and quite frankly, it's notable that historically they admit to and record a lot of their more shameful moments that some of their leaders have had and some of their people have had. And it's to our benefit that they record the shortcomings that they've had. So we don't want to look down on them. We also don't want to treat them as more than they are. Ultimately, this is looking at the work of God, and it's a lesson and a warning to us, to our faithfulness to God and our devotion to Jesus Christ.
So last week we covered the first Passover, which was described in Exodus 12. God asked that we celebrate it as a 7-day feast to the Lord, and it was a permanent ordinance, which means it should be celebrated every year. Now we're going to look at two things throughout the history. We're going to look first at if the Israelites always celebrated Passover as God told them to, and then also how historic events have shaped how Passover looks today. We need to start by seeing what happened at the first Passover, so we have sort of a starting point to know how things began, to see how things changed as they were added. The first Passover was very practical. It was necessary for them to be saved from that final plague of the death of the firstborn. They did this by marking their households with the blood to show that they belonged to God. It united them as a nation, and God told them how they would celebrate Passover in the years to come to commemorate the event. They were told to celebrate it for 7 days, beginning at the twilight of the 14th day of the first month of the Jewish calendar, which is called Nisan. They were to clean out all the chametz, which is their word for leaven. Now remember, leaven is a symbol of sin. So they had to clean out all the chametz in the spirit of cleaning out the sin from their lives in preparation for Passover. There were three foods mentioned that they were to eat. Those were the matzah, which is the unleavened bread, the maror, which is the bitter herbs, and the lamb. And at the first Passover, the lamb was used on the doorposts to save their firstborn. They were to eat the meat with haste and be ready to leave immediately. Each household did it and was not made into corporate worship until later years because they didn't have a tabernacle or a temple. In years to come, they were told that they would have a holy assembly on the first night and the 7th night of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. If chametz was found in their homes during the 7 days, the person was to be cut off from the Israel. And any male, whether it be a priest, a slave, a sojourner, they had to have been circumcised in order to participate.
So going down our list of Passover through history, after the Exodus, they head into the wilderness. And they spend at least 41 years in the wilderness. It could be as many as 45. Numbers 9, 1 through 5 is a section that tells us about the Israelites celebrating the Passover the first year after their exodus from Egypt. And it looks like they did a good job following God's statutes. It's almost like a demo mode of Passover. There are a few things that are notable about this. Since this is the first Passover, they run into a couple of logistical problems. Firstly, they have a few men who had become unclean because they had to deal with a dead body. And so they did what any self-respecting Jew in that generation did, and they complained. And they said, it's not fair. How come we don't get to celebrate Passover with everybody else because we're unclean? And God agreed, and at this point he institutes a basically second opportunity for Passover. So there's a second chance Passover that takes place in the second month of the year. So the command for Passover is in the first month of the year, but you do have a second chance if you're unclean during the first month that you can take part in Passover in the second month, but you still have to keep all of the statutes exactly like you do for the first Passover, with the sacrificial lamb and the removing of the leaven from the bread and the whole 9 yards. And so while they do celebrate the Passover that first year in the wilderness, there's no record of them celebrating the Passover any of the other years in the wilderness. And there's some indication that they may, in fact, have not celebrated it for any of them, at the very least not corporately. Jewish tradition says that they didn't celebrate it, and we can see that after they cross into the promised land, they have to circumcise everybody because that generation had not been circumcised. And since we know you have to be circumcised to partake in the Passover, it's reasonable to assume that their parents had not celebrated the Passover since the 12 spies in Canaan. It's as if they had just given up on God at that point and said, well, we can't enter the land, we're done. However, after they enter into the land to begin taking it over, they circumcise themselves, set up camp, and take time to heal.
Now, as they come into the promised land, they enter the period where they started to be ruled by judges. And if you want to look at your worksheets, if you're following along on the worksheet, we're going to draw a bracket from that period of the judges. We're going to draw the bracket to kings, the first temple being built, the division into Israel and Judah, and all the way down to the Assyrian exile. Make a bracket around those. Now, these are being grouped together for a certain reason. We are going to read a quick verse out of 2 Kings chapter 23, verse 22. It says, "For no such Passover had been kept since the days of the judges who judged Israel, or during all the days of the kings of Israel, or of the kings of Judah." This is in the midst of a section talking about Passover during the reign of King Josiah. We'll look at that more in a moment. This verse tells us that during this period of 600 some years, Israel was not even really commemorating Passover in the way that God had told them to. Doesn't mean that they weren't necessarily celebrating a Passover at all, but it wasn't in the way that God had told them to.
Now, it's interesting to note that during this period, that doesn't mean that the people were avoiding God or not connected with God at all. It just means they weren't celebrating the Passover. However, you can see how avoiding this celebration, this commemoration of what God had done and who God is, had some side effects of getting some kings into trouble. One thing that's important to understand is as they began to settle down, they tied together very strongly the ideas of springtime, the ideas of harvest, which their wheat harvest occurs in the springtime in that land, and the ideas of Passover. So Passover, unleavened bread, springtime, and first fruits are all ideas that are tied together. So you see in 2 Samuel 11, when David looks out and sees Bathsheba, which is the woman who gets him into so much trouble, or rather the woman with which he gets into so much trouble, it says it's in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle. And now there's two issues with this. First off, it's the spring of the year. And so that idea of springtime should immediately trigger in our reading, oh, that's Passover time. We also see in the law that's handed down with the idea of celebrating the first fruits that every man in Israel was supposed to come to the place God chose and present himself. And God gives a promise that if they do this, the enemies will not covet their lands and won't come and try to take their land from them while they're presenting themselves. So we see, first off, they're not trusting God to protect their land like he commands them to, and they're also not gathering. And in the process of not gathering, David has this opportunity which ultimately leads to the death of his first son through Bathsheba and a whole bunch of trouble for his kingdom in general. And so while David was a man after God's own heart, we can see how David's skipping over of the Passover also indirectly led to a fair amount of grief for him.
And it's also kind of interesting because there's almost a parallel there with the death of his firstborn that you could draw.
There is, yeah. When he skipped the celebration of the Passover and instead went and celebrated sin, and as a result, he did lose his firstborn.
Another thing that's kind of interesting about that period of time, well, two things. We hear in the Bible that David was a man after God's heart, so we know that he was honoring God. He did love God, and God loved him, and yet he wasn't celebrating Passover in the way that God had commanded. So we know that even when we aren't completely following, God doesn't give up on us. He still loves us, and we can still live lives that are somewhat honoring. I mean, it's not perfect for sure, but it's interesting to see that God calls him a man after his own heart. Also, that Solomon was married to a woman who was an Egyptian, correct?
Yeah.
And that would have been interesting had he celebrated Passover, having the in-laws over, and you're celebrating this feast that is in remembrance of leaving the slavery to essentially what would have been your in-laws.
So it's surprising at first that Solomon didn't celebrate the Passover, because you would think Solomon, who builds the first temple in all of its splendor and goes through all that effort and work to honor God, and then he doesn't gather the people together and celebrate the Passover. But at the same time, we see being married to Pharaoh's daughter, that would make it a very awkward celebration. To recount how God smote the Egyptians and brought his people out and destroyed this nation's power and hold over them with God's mighty hand and outstretched arm. And that would get really awkward around the dinner table. So while at first it's surprising, it's also very understandable why he may have shied away from that kind of celebration.
We're going to look at a section in 2 Chronicles chapter 30 about Hezekiah. Now, Hezekiah didn't always follow God. He kind of had a turnaround later in his life. And he did celebrate Passover. It wasn't perfect. It was during the second month instead of the first, which, if you remember from earlier, that was kind of the makeup Passover. And the reason they did this occurrence was because the priests had not consecrated themselves in a sufficient number. And in verse 10 of chapter 30 there, we see that couriers were sent out to tell the people to come to Jerusalem for the Passover. And some of the people laughed them to scorn and mocked them. So the spirit of the people was not in support of the Passover. Hezekiah tried. He went forward with this Passover. His son Manasseh and his grandson Ammon also had a lot of difficulty with their falling away from God and idol worship and whatnot. So we have a couple generations here that continue on past Hezekiah, and then we go forward to his great-grandson, King Josiah.
Josiah steps into the throne very young, at the age of 8, and he gets the idea that he wants to repair the temple. And it's really easy to read a lot of religiosity into this, but it's my impression that this started off as a public work. The temple was one of the largest, most ornate buildings in the nation. It ranked near the 7 wonders of the world. It was an amazing structure. For it to have fallen to ruin is kind of to the shame of his people. And so I think that Josiah first begins to get the temple fixed up because he wants to advertise Israel as this great place again. So as they're cleaning up the temple, the high priest finds the book of the law, like stashed in a back room. And he reads it, and he kind of panics because he sees that there's these blessings and these curses, and they are not doing anything to receive the blessings, but they are doing a lot to receive curses. And so he takes this book of the law and reads it to Josiah, and Josiah is cut to the heart. He tears his clothes, mourns, and he repents, and he leads his whole nation to repentance. And so they prepare and celebrate a big corporate Passover. And throughout the rest of his rule, Josiah goes to work aggressively and violently tearing down places of idol worship throughout his country. And he really went all out on this. He didn't just tear one or two down. He didn't just remove them from the temple courts as some of his ancestors had done. He went all throughout the nation, tore down every single one, and even executed all of the false prophets and would burn their bodies and desecrate these high places and these places of idol worship so that no one would ever go there and worship false gods again to bring God to anger. We can see that Josiah was a very different kind of king from pretty much anyone in his line.
There's, in fact, a verse in 2 Kings 23, verse 25. It says, "Before him there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul, with all his might, according to all the law of Moses, nor did any like him arise after him." We thought that was just kind of interesting because those heart, mind, might, soul, however it's translated in your Bible, is something that we see of how we are to love God with all our heart, with all our soul, and with all our mind. And that is how Josiah is described here.
So only a few decades later, unfortunately, the people have forgotten their good king who followed God with all he had, and they've gone astray again, and God allows them to fall to the Babylonians. And so they're taken into captivity, and the temple is destroyed. All of their objects of worship are carried off, and the temple itself is burned. And this most likely sparked a very intense change of Passover for Israel. I don't think during this time of exile they stopped practicing like they did in the wilderness. I think they continued to practice, and there's some hints at this. For example, Ezekiel tells them how they will rebuild the temple when they return and how they ought to celebrate the Passover. And so it's likely that they were practicing and celebrating some variety or some version of the Passover that's possibly quite similar to the way they celebrate today. They don't have a temple while they're in exile, and so they probably would have foregone the sacrificial lamb, but they may well have had elements of mourning the temple, and some of their extra traditions may have started at this point in time where they mourn the loss of their temple, where they would hope for perhaps next year in Jerusalem we'll be able to celebrate.
In the book of Ezra, we see the Jewish exiles returning to Jerusalem after they have been in Babylon, and they're able to rebuild the temple. This is completed the month before Nisan, which, if you remember, is the month that they are supposed to celebrate the Passover. And so as they prepare for the Passover, I almost get the impression that they are meticulous as they're preparing. It says that all the priests and the Levites purified themselves so that they were all clean. This is a contrast to how things looked when Hezekiah was celebrating Passover, and they had trouble getting enough priests to be consecrated to even celebrate on time. All of their offerings are thoroughly listed in this section. And I almost have a theory that the Pharisees, as we know them in the New Testament, could have come out of this meticulous desire to do things God's way and to do things right, to avoid being taken away into exile before, because that was part of the reason they were taken into exile, was because they were not following God, and God allowed them to be ruled by their own desires, and that obviously did not go well. And so they very possibly could have been making laws about the laws about the laws, going beyond what God had prescribed for them to do in hopes to avoid displeasing God and being taken away to exile again.
So we can draw a bracket from destruction of the first temple down past Babylonian captivity, past the return to Zion, and down to Queen Esther and Purim. And it was likely that they celebrated a version of Passover, though without the lamb, during this period of time. up until the second temple is rebuilt. And now after this temple is rebuilt, and then after this temple is rebuilt, we enter a period of time that some scholars have called the quiet years, or this long silence of about 400 years where there's no prophet who comes along to get added into their book of the law and prophets. And while some people, why is God so quiet? This may actually be a good thing. Most of the prophets are there to tell Israel how they're in danger because of their worshiping of other gods. And this exile into Babylon seems to have cured them of their desire to follow other gods. And it may be that this period of time is so quiet because the Jews are actually relatively faithful in their following of God. In fact, in this entire quiet period, there's only one little real whisper that God says, I'm still here. And that occurs around what we see as the celebration of Hanukkah, where for a period of time they come under the power of some Greek rulers. The land of Israel is a really popular land for superpowers in the ancient world to take over because it's a crossroads. You need to hold it if you want to move large amounts of troops or supplies across continents. It's pretty much the bridge between Europe, Asia, and Africa. And so during this period of time, around 200 BC, they're being ruled by some Greeks who see them as a bit of a problem. And so the ruler reasons that the center of Jews is their faith. So if he can get them to stop practicing their faith, he can get the Jews to scatter and they won't be such a problem anymore. And so we have the Maccabees, who are the sons of Maccabee, surprisingly, and they start an underground resistance, and eventually they rise up and take back the temple against all odds, against a superior force with superior arms. But they have a little problem. They take the temple back, they reconsecrate it, and they're in such a hurry to be able to worship God again the way they have. They light the menorah, which is a symbol of God's presence. It's supposed to be a light that burns forever inside the temple. But they only have enough oil to keep it operating for one day. And this oil is a very pure olive oil that's going to take them 7 days to prepare more. And so they go to work in faith, and God performs a miracle. The oil that was only supposed to be able to burn for one day burns for 8 entire days until they're able to make more oil. And so this light that symbolizes God's presence in the temple is God's little whisper to his people that even during these quiet years where there's not a prophet shouting in the streets, that he is still there. This celebration of Hanukkah is a neat piece of history, not just for the Jewish people, but we can also see in John 10:22 that Jesus celebrates or is at something that is translated as the Feast of Dedication most of the time. But this Feast of Dedication is a celebration of the rededication of the temple, which is Hanukkah. So it's cool to think that Jesus celebrated Hanukkah, and that Jesus may have helped light a menorah to commemorate that, yes, God is here. And from there, we jump forward through the quiet years to the time of Jesus.
Now, if you look into any of Jewish traditions and teachings, you'll come across the name Hillel. He's one of the most important figures in Jewish history. Hillel was born in Babylon during the 1st century, and he was a prominent Jewish leader in Jerusalem. So there's likely to be some overlap in the lifetimes of Jesus and Hillel. There's a lot of folklore, perhaps, that could be built around Hillel. It is hard to tell which is folklore, which is the one Hillel we see mentioned a lot, and how much is another Hillel or somebody from his school of thought, because there's just a lot of conversation around this name and a lot attributed to him, and some of it does get kind of stretched further from what truth probably would be. And so we don't know how much is this one man or not. But anyway, Hillel is of note for us because as we celebrate our Seder, there is a part where you make a sandwich, which they call a korech. And it is said that this started with Hillel. He took the three original elements, which are the matzah, the maror, and the lamb, and he made them into the sandwich. And it's kind of a neat idea because it would be a good way to eat in haste, as the first Passover would have needed to be done in order to get out of Egypt. They would have combined them perhaps into one thing that they could take and eat quickly, and so they celebrate that at Passover even today.
And we can see on our timeline that Jesus' birth appears after Hillel. And there is the famous story in Luke 2 where Mary and Joseph have taken Jesus to Passover. They have all traveled together, and they are getting ready, and they go back, and they travel a day and look around and realize that Jesus was not with them. It was probably one of those mix-ups where Mary thought he was with Joseph, Joseph thought he was with Mary, or they thought he was with some of his cousins in the caravan. At any rate, they can't find him. They run back to Jerusalem to try to find him, and they look for 3 days before they finally find him in the temple talking with rabbis who are impressed with his questions and understanding. And he tells them, why are you surprised to find me here? Didn't you know I would have to be in my Father's house? But it's interesting to think that these rabbis he's talking with, Hillel may well have been among their numbers. In fact, I would say it's probable that Hillel would be among the rabbis that he's talking with during this period of time where his parents are hurriedly searching for Jesus in a bit of a frantic, scared parental rush.
So during Jesus' ministry in John chapter 2, there's a section after the wedding at Cana, which is where his ministry sort of begins. And it talks about Jesus cleansing the temple, where he gets the whips out, and he's overturning the tables, and all the people that are in the temple, money changers, just basically desecrating God's house and trying to make money off of it. And Jesus does this as they are preparing for Passover. So just as they would be cleaning the chametz, the leaven, the sin out of their lives, you have these people gathering in the temple doing these horrible things, and rightly so, Jesus is outraged. And so it's interesting to look at that and understand more of the symbolism when you see the traditions of Passover and how Jesus responds.
And we see that Jesus does clear the temple twice, at least, that he's this is done at the beginning of his ministry, and this is done again at the final Passover, at which we have the event of the Last Supper. And there's a lot of verses around this, and we'll go into and learn much more about the Last Supper Passover meal in weeks to come, because it's a really big deal, and it really ties the idea of Passover to our idea of Easter. But in Luke 22, 7 through 13, it says very explicitly that Jesus is sending his followers to prepare the Passover, and that the meal in the upper room was in fact a Passover. And this is a turning point both in Christian history and Jewish tradition, because going forward, at first it was very difficult to tell the difference between a Jew and a Christian. They looked pretty much identical. They would have been ethnically the same. They would have been from the same part of the world largely, because, well, all of Jesus' disciples were Jews. And so many of the Jews began to, and their rabbis began to find ways to differentiate their Passover from the way the Christians celebrated. And so, and they had to do this in some ways because there are so many parallels that draw you to Christ in the celebration of the Passover, where they, have to trust in the blood of their Passover lamb, and Jesus comes as our Passover lamb, and many, many more. And so they go through and change things. They begin doing things like anywhere where there's 3 things in their Seder, they try to change it to 4 or more, because 3 seems Trinitarian, and from the very early days, the Christians made a big deal out of Jesus telling them to baptize in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So some concept of the Trinity has been around since the first century, and a lot of places where you would see three things, they would stack them up to become 4 or 5, so that you didn't have this number 3 pointing back to the Christian idea of Trinity. However, there is one very striking place that number of 3 remains, which we'll get into next week when we cover the elements of the Seder plate.
But it is of note, even though they made those changes, like you're saying with upcoming studies, we'll see, but there are things that remain that still really draw us in and see a parallel between who Jesus is and the celebration of Passover as parallels, because God is that big and he can't be erased. His hand in all this human tradition, he remains.
And ultimately, whatever they add, the Jews are waiting and looking forward to the coming of Messiah. And so it's only natural that anything that they add will be looking forward to Messiah, which Jesus is the Messiah. So anything that they will add that's messianic in nature will just naturally point back over to Jesus.
Right. Now, we didn't have you do this before, but if you want to draw a bracket from above the second temple being built down to the rededication of the temple, Hillel the Elder, Jesus' birth, Jesus' childhood, Jesus' ministry, and the Last Supper, we can group those together. During that time period, it would appear that they celebrated Passover as God had commanded, corporately, meeting at the temple to do this celebration. Now we're going to transition to a new time period where we're going to have a little bracket around the destruction of the Second Temple, and I suppose you could put it around the Diaspora too, because they kind of go hand in hand. This happened at 70 A.D. The Jews were likely gathering in Jerusalem during some of this time of siege in Jerusalem by the Romans, and Josephus, the Jewish historian, said that there were so many lives lost in Jerusalem because they were there for the Passover, and they would all come and gather there in Jerusalem to celebrate together. And that's of note because some historians will look at it and say, well, there's no way this many people were lost. There's not that many people in Jerusalem. However, if people are making pilgrimages and coming to Jerusalem because they're coming for Passover, it would be an elevated number. After the destruction of the temple, there was a lot of poverty. There was scattering of people, either because they were being taken as slaves throughout the Roman Empire or because they're just fleeing for their lives. And we call that the Diaspora. And because the temple was destroyed, they no longer will serve lamb at Passover because the lamb is the sacrifice that they make to God. And since they have no temple, they will not sacrifice a lamb anymore.
Now, we differentiate from this because as we celebrate our Seder, we will have lamb. And we do this symbolically to point out, first off, they don't have lamb because they can't make sacrifices. We have lamb because the lamb is not a sacrifice for us. Our sacrifice, the final sacrifice, was Jesus Christ. We also do it to symbolically point to, on their Seder plate, they will have a lamb shank bone to remind them to be sad that they can't celebrate at the temple and they cannot sacrifice. And we will have actual lamb because our Passover lamb has come and has died and our salvation is here. And so we incorporate this difference, and we believe that as Christians it's fine to have lamb on Passover, or lamb as we celebrate a Messianic Seder. And now around this time, a lot of traditions around Passover evolved and changed. For example, they took the lamb out. They also added other elements to mourn for the temple and mourn for their inability to celebrate the way that they had when the temple stood. And as they spread out into different places, different cultures, different agricultural or climate areas, and they adapted the Passover as they went to those different areas. So first, let's discuss Sephardic Jews. Now, Sephardi means Spain in Hebrew, and so these are the Jews that would have initially gone out and settled into the Iberian Peninsula. And eventually they were later dispersed again in the Spanish Inquisition and would have spread throughout northern Africa to the Middle East. And so, whereas with the other group we'll talk about, the Ashkenazi, we will see they have specific rules, a specific culture, and even a specific set of genetics that you can trace. But since the Sephardi were dispersed multiple times and spread so geographically, through a geographically broad area, they have much more broad ways to celebrate. They have a much broader set of rules. And so they can check and see if you have Ashkenazi DNA because they were kept together, but they can't really check and see if you have Sephardi DNA, aside from being just Jewish DNA.
Much of the dispersal that happened in response to the Spanish Inquisition was around the 1400s. And this happened because there was a push to Christianize the Iberian Peninsula. So we're talking about the areas of Spain and Portugal and that part of Europe. The same king and queen who sent Columbus to America is also the one who told the Jews that they either needed to convert to Catholicism or they needed to get out of Spain. Now, to maintain their livelihoods, many of the Jews falsely converted so that they could continue living there. But the monarchy and the church realized how many of these conversions weren't genuine, and they began scrutinizing the new conversos, is what they would have called them.
So while the monarchy suddenly realized that they hadn't forced these Jews to abandon their faith in exchange for Christ, rather than realizing you can't force a person to do that and treating them with love, they thought, we'll try harder. And so they began to look and try to find these secret or crypto Jews. And so they would become very sneaky to continue their inquisition to remove them from Spain. And so they would do things like go around and on Saturday and look to see if anyone had a chimney that didn't have smoke coming out, because lighting a fire is work, and you can't do work on the Sabbath or the Saturday if you are Jewish, whereas a Christian would light a fire on a Saturday. And so if you didn't light a fire on a Saturday, you were likely to get called out and told to pack your bags and leave or be killed. Another thing they would search for is in the spring, as Passover was coming, if families began to buy a large number of vegetables right before Pesach or Passover, they would use this as another hint that this is a Jewish family that's practicing in secret. Because since you clean out the chametz and you cannot have risen bread, vegetables become a very popular way to fill up your dishes in places where bread would have taken the space. And so this was a really terrible time that really spread these Sephardi Jews across Africa and the Middle East and even into the East. But it was also a really terrible time where many were tortured and killed simply for believing differently.
Now that's the Sephardic Jews. So the other main large group of Jews is called the Ashkenazi. And Ashkenazi is a Hebrew word for Germany. And a lot of these Jews settled in sort of that central sort of area, Western Europe. And through time, there was many expulsions of the Jewish people throughout Europe. It didn't happen just a couple times. There was very many. And so they started looking for a place where it was safer and they were more accepted. And during the 1300s, there was an area of the world called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And a lot of the Jews went here because it was one of the more religiously tolerant areas in Europe. They thrived here, but eventually the country was divided up, and so much of the land they were on became part of Russia. And Russia was much less tolerant of the Jewish people. So Russia developed what we know as the Pale of Settlement. And this was an area of land where the Jews were allowed to live in, but they were forbidden to leave at free will. They weren't allowed to live in some of the larger cities in the Pale, and they weren't allowed to own land to support their families during some periods of this Pale of Settlement. They formed shtetls, which were small Jewish villages in the Pale. Anatevka from the play or the book or the movie, whichever you want to pick, Fiddler on the Roof, is a fictional shtetl, and it takes place during this period of time through the Pale and shows a little glimpse into how life would have been. There was a lot of poverty. There was a lot of violent pogroms, and this is where people would come in, and a lot of anti-Semitism would just ignite, and there was people who had their property destroyed, people were killed. That one scene in Fiddler on the Roof where the wedding is taking place and people come in and they just start breaking things is a very mild version of some of the pogroms that occurred in the Pale.
So in this area and during this period of time, since there was such poverty and they were restricted into this part of the world which had a very different climate, this made some changes in the ways that they would celebrate their seders. For example, on the Seder plate, we are supposed to have the maror, which traditionally has been some kind of lettuce. The problem is they're living in Central to Northern Europe, and it's kind of hard to come by lettuce in March, which is when the Passover tends to be. In place of their maror, their lettuce, they would begin using horseradish, and in place of the karpas, which is supposed to be a green vegetable or a green herb, you didn't have green herbs sprouting yet, so they would begin using potatoes in their Seder dishes. And some families do this all the way up to the present. At the very least, potato dishes are very prevalent Passover fare. And so this period changed the way they did things because of climate. It also changed how they did some things because of the poverty. For example, as part of the Passover, they enjoy 4 cups of wine. And wine is a little bit of a luxury item. A lot of impoverished families can't get their hands on enough, if any. And so it began to ask questions like, how much wine do we have to have? Is it possible, if we can only get a little wine, that the head of the household, the father, can drink the cups symbolically for the rest of the family? Is it possible that we can substitute tea for wine if we can't get our hands on any? And fortunately, this isn't a problem that we have any questions that we need to answer about, because we live in such a wealthy part of the world and in such a wealthy time period. But this did force them to examine and kind of refine their traditions and how they celebrated.
Now, the Pale of Settlement came to an end kind of with Russia during World War I. Still, living in that area, you would have a large number of Jewish families. So between there and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there was a lot of Jewish people in that area of the world. And this is why during World War II, there was so many concentration camps and the Warsaw ghettos, and all of this part of our history takes place because there's such a concentration of Jewish people and the anti-Semitism that is found around them. There's a lot of parallels if you look at the Exodus and the Holocaust, and it's kind of interesting to see that and how that might have had an effect on these people as they are going through these horrible times and still mindful of the Passover celebration. There was a memoir. It is from the perspective of a lady who was a child during World War II and ended up being alone and taken in by this French farmer, and she was living in his cellar with a number of other children, and they were all Jewish, and it was through the winter, and so they were able to see some grass start growing at one point out the little bit of a window that they had, that the farmer would bring the provisions each day for them. And so they knew that it had to be Passover because spring and Passover go hand in hand. And so to celebrate as much as any child living in a cellar during the Holocaust can, they exchanged clothes with each other to make it like as if they were having new clothes on and getting to celebrate very fancy and everything. And then they also requested a few items like a newspaper, a match, some flour, and a bottle of water. And these children tried to make their own matzah in this cellar and be able to celebrate the Passover and the meaning that would have as you're commemorating these people and the horrid lives that they were living in Egypt and the freedom that they'd gained coming out, to be able to celebrate that in very similar conditions during the Holocaust, how much meaning that would give that celebration for them in years to come.
Now, a lot has happened in world history since the Holocaust, and in some ways as a direct or indirect result, such as the founding of the State of Israel. And so let's fast forward to today, where we see there's some newer trends in reference to Passover. And we see that God has established Passover as a feast to the Lord, is how it's put in Exodus. So this feast is about Him. It's about His love. It's about His power. It's about His salvation. Passover exists so that we will recognize and remember Him, that He is the preeminent and only God, that He is strong and saves His people with an outstretched arm. But today, some people have added elements such as an orange on the Seder plate to symbolize LGBT inclusion, or olives in support of peace between the Israelis and Palestinian factions. They'll put an artichoke on in support of interfaith families, or tomatoes on their Seder plate in support of farm workers' rights. And some of these are ironically directly against commands that they have in their law, but others are actually good things. However, I don't see this as being appropriate on the Seder plate. Because again, while there's nothing wrong with peace in the Middle East, who wouldn't want that? And there's nothing wrong with farmers having rights to earn money from the produce that they work hard to grow. But it doesn't point to God. It doesn't point to His strength and His power. Whereas instead of having lettuce, eating horseradish, and shedding tears even involuntarily over the Jewish people and their slavery, and also our sin symbolically at the same time, that does point to God. That is an attempt to honor Him in the way He prescribed for His Passover. Whereas putting a tomato on your plate to think of the farmers actually subtracts and distracts from God and what He's done. And so, as with all tradition, we need to be careful that any changes or additions that are made are about being true and honest with the core of the celebration, that it's about keeping it as a perpetual ordinance to the Lord.
We see this happening within Christianity as well. During our traditions, whether it be Easter and people celebrating Easter egg hunts and candy in the Easter eggs, there's nothing wrong with doing that. But when we neglect to make it a reminder of the sweet, wonderful sacrifice and gift that we're given through Jesus' death and resurrection, if we don't make that connection to our children, then it's a holiday just about hide and seek and finding eggs, and we lose the meaning.
And we should work to avoid this. We should work to avoid this slippery slope where we're just putting up a tree, we're just opening presents, we're just coloring eggs. We should work to make sure that our ceremonies, our celebrations point back to God. And there are two really great ways that we can work very intentionally to make this happen. And that's the first one: be intentional about it. Don't celebrate things spur of the moment. If you're thinking about adding or incorporating something new into your celebration, really stop and pray about it and give it some thought. How can you use this inclusion to steer someone towards God? And the other is to intentionally use these celebrations as a teaching moment for our children. The Passover has a lot that revolves around the asking of questions. And kids will ask questions, especially about exciting and fun things that we're doing different. And so we need to be ready with answers. So being prepared to take these and turn them into teaching moments will help keep us from starting to head down that slope where we just go through motions, have candy, share presents, and turn it into a celebration that's about family, or a celebration about some other good thing, or even a celebration of greed and commercialism, instead of celebrating Jesus Christ and what he's done for us in coming to this earth and dying on the cross for our sins.
Right, and this doesn't even just have to be for our children. We can do this with our peers as well. When we stand out and we are different, it's okay. It's okay to have something that makes somebody go, "Why are you doing that?" Those are good moments for teaching and honest answers for us to reflect on what we are celebrating, so that we make sure we are orienting ourselves around the truth of who God is and what he has done for us, and share it with other people.
It's also worthwhile to take a moment and consider what things are we celebrating that we maybe should not. Around Christmas time, it's very easy to spot the Jews because of their lack of Christmas festivities. They'll have Hanukkah and all that goes along with that, but everyone knew the Jewish kid in their school, or the Jewish families in their schools, because during Christmas time they became set apart because of how they didn't celebrate. And it's worth taking time to consider what celebrations might we want to abstain from, as well as considering how we want to celebrate the traditions that mean a lot and are packed with symbolism.